Hello again, Grammie here, and it's time for Chapter 2 of The Secret Window. It's a long chapter, so I'm going to get right into it. So, without further ado, I'm going to read. Chapter 2 of The Secret Window, The Big Explosion. Meg had been very little, maybe 6 or 7, when the dreams began. At first, she'd taken them for granted. Her mother might be surprised and annoyed at Grandma Korshak's unannounced visits from nearby Washiga, but Meg usually knew when she was coming. She'd leave an extra hanger in her closet for Grandma's nightgown and clear a space on the bureau top for Grandma's hairbrush and false teeth cup. Bill might be shocked when diggers and trucks rolled into the vacant lot down the block to destroy the only place in the neighborhood where he could collect insects and butterflies. But Meg knew they were coming. Her father might be thrilled because the Sunday Milwaukee Journal unexpectedly printed one of his poems. But it was Meg who got up early that particular morning to fetch the newspaper from the foyer of their apartment building. No one seemed to notice that when others were startled, Meg was not. When Meg was 8, there was a fire early in January at the Pansino's house in the next block. Meg, Bill, and their parents stood at the living room window and watched the red fire engine lights leaping and whirling through a curtain of snow. Tiny dark figures appeared and disappeared, and once a finger of flame glowed in the twilight. After a while, her father and Bill went out to have a closer look at what was happening, and her mother went back to the blouse she was stitching on the sewing machine. Meg crouched at the window, terrified. When her father and Bill returned, she ran to meet them. Their faces were red with cold, and there were snowflakes caught in her father's dark beard. "Don't look so worried, Meggie," he said. "The Pansino's Christmas tree caught fire, and the living room is a mess, but that's the worst of it. They think the cat pulled on the wires and caused a short. And guess what the only thing Mrs. Pansino carried out of the house with her?" Bill's eyes sparkled behind his glasses. Meg knew. "The cat," she said. "Right!" Her brother pulled one of her pigtails. "You're a smart kid, you know that?" He went off to his room whistling, and Meg leaned against the couch, alone now with her father. He was back at the window, shoulders hunched, hands thrust in his pockets. "I knew about the cat, and I knew about the fire," Meg whispered, almost hoping he wouldn't hear. He turned to look at her. "Knew about it? How?" he asked lightly. His thin face was shadowed in the gloom. Behind him, snowflakes danced across the window pane. "I had a dream a couple of nights ago. The fire and the snowstorm, and there was a lady running into the street with a cat in her arms." Suddenly, Meg was sobbing against her father's jacket. "But I didn't see the house up close, and I wasn't sure it was Mrs. Pansino. It was just something that happened in a dream." Her father sat down and pulled her onto his lap. "Of course it was, baby," he said. "Dreaming about a fire is no big deal." "But it was this fire," Meg sobbed. "I was standing in the snow and I saw the fire trucks coming." "No, you didn't." His voice was still quiet, but it had changed. He sounded angry. Meg looked up and saw that his lips were tight under his bed. "Stop crying now before Mama hears you," he said. "We all have times when we're sure we've seen a thing or done a thing before. It's just a trick the mind sometimes plays on us. Don't get so excited." "But I did dream it," Meg insisted, "really and truly. And maybe if I'd looked hard, I could have seen it was Mrs. Pansino and—" "Now stop that!" Meg felt herself being pushed from her father's lap. "You're imagining things, and that's all there is to it. Listen to me, Meg. He pulled her around and lifted her chin so that she stared into his eyes. "Don't you say anything to Mama about this dream. She'd be very upset, and you don't want that." He let her go and stood up. "It's crazy to blame yourself for the Pansino's fire just because you happened to dream about a fire, baby. If you dreamt about a fire. So just forget about it." But of course she couldn't forget about it. Her father had said crazy. And that was the word that stayed in her mind. It was crazy to have dreams that came true. If you talked about them, it upset the people you loved and make them angry. She had learned something bad about herself, an ugly secret. That night she had been afraid to go to sleep. About a year later, Meg began the notebook. She'd had hundreds of dreams that year, but a few had been much more real than others, and most of these real dreams had come true. Even though there wasn't another as terrifying as the fire dream, Meg became increasingly disturbed. She thought of telling Bill, but if he didn't believe her, if his voice and his face changed the way her father's had, she thought she'd die. She couldn't take a chance, and so finally she'd bought a spiral-bound notebook and had begun to write down the more vivid dreams as soon as she woke up. She'd chosen a book with flowers and birds on the cover, but that didn't make her feel cheerful when she wrote in it. Writing was just something she had to do because of her craziness. 3.5 years later, she'd filled more than half the pages. Many of the dreams she'd written down had come true. Some had not. In a funny kind of way, the book had become her best friend as well as her greatest shame. Meg's mind was on the notebook and the latest addition to it as she walked home from school with her friend Gracie Riston the next afternoon. She could hardly wait to find out if Mr. Corcoran had called Bill to his office to tell him he had won the contest. "You're not listening," Gracie accused her. "I don't have to let you in on this, you know." Meg wrenched her thoughts away from her brother. "Yes, I am." She searched her mind for a clue to what Gracie had been saying. "Linda Bell's slumber party. You're the only one in the 7th grade who's invited." "And I can bring one friend," Gracie said, "as long as it's someone Linda likes. She's pretty particular, but I think she likes you." Meg waited, not quite sure whether she was being invited or not. "Well, do you want to go or don't you?" Gracie demanded. "If you don't, I'm going to ask Jean Monroe." "Sure I want to go," Meg said, "but I have to check with my mother. If it's for overnight, she'll want to call Mrs. Bell and make sure it's okay." "Of course it's okay." Gracie's voice was squeaky with impatience. "If she calls Mrs. Bell, Linda will be furious. Look." She flipped open her math book and took out a slightly battered slip of paper. "Give your mother this, and it'll be all right." Meg looked at the paper. It was a typewritten note saying Linda had permission to have a party and her parents would be home all evening. The note was signed Mrs. J. Bell. "Well, I guess that's okay then." Meg slid the note into a pocket of her shoulder bag. "I'll tell her Mrs. Bell doesn't want to be bothered with a lot of people calling her up." They had reached the front door of Meg's apartment building. "I'm coming up with you," Gracie announced. "Your mother's home on Wednesdays, isn't she? You can ask her now." Meg nodded reluctantly. "Wednesday afternoons? But she might be out shopping. I can call you tonight after I talk to her." "I'd rather find out now," Gracie said. "If you can't go, I'm calling Jean as soon as I get home." Meg gave up. Gracie was used to having her own way, but it could be awful asking about the party with someone else listening. If her mother was irritable or depressed, as she was most of the time lately, the answer was sure to be no. The chances for a yes were much better if Meg could choose the time carefully. When they reached the 4th floor, Meg tried once more to change Gracie's mind about waiting for an answer. I think my mother's gone out. I'm almost sure of it. Gracie gave her a little shove toward the apartment door. No, she's in there. I can hear her talking. Wow. Meg listened. It was her mother, all right. Meg couldn't make out the words, but the tone was too loud, too harsh for ordinary conversation. She must be talking on the phone, Meg said, and hoped it was right. But as she unlocked the door and pushed it open, her heart sank. This was no telephone conversation. The second voice had been too deep to be heard out in the hall. Her mother and father were having an argument. Sick and tired of it, her mother shouted. I have to do everything while you sit in here and scribble all day. It isn't right. I've had enough. It's time you make up your mind what really matters to you. Meg panicked, turning to Gracie. Her friend made a little face. It'll be over soon, said Gracie. Don't worry about it. Let's go out in the kitchen and have a Coke. Meg would have preferred to run from the apartment, but Gracie was already on her way to the kitchen. Meg followed on tiptoe with a quick glance down the hall toward her parents' room. Her father was speaking now, his voice low but angry. Then her mother started again. I mean it. You can't have everything your way. Her tone was chilling. Make up your mind what you really want. Gracie went to the kitchen window and looked out while she waited for her Coke. My mom and dad used to do that a lot, she said. I was glad when he moved out. Meg poured Coke into glasses, managing to spill quite a bit of it. Then she closed the kitchen door. Oh, well, she said, trying to match Gracie's casual tone. They'll be laughing in a few minutes, I'm sure of it. But even as she said it, she was not sure it was true. I'd go, except I have to know about the party, Gracie said. Do you think you could just run in for a minute and... No! Meg yelled. If Gracie knew so much about family arguments, she ought to know this was no time to ask for something. The bedroom door banged and they both jumped. Meg winced as her mother's step snapped sharply down the hall. The kitchen door flew open and crashed against the stove. What in the world? Her mother's face was white and her eyes were red and sore-looking. She took a step backward when she saw that Meg wasn't alone. Hi, Mrs. Korshak. Oh, hello, Gracie. She went over to the refrigerator and stood with her back to the girls, taking out covered dishes and salad makings. They watched until Meg couldn't bear the silence any longer. I'm invited to a slumber party at Linda Bell's Saturday night. Mrs. Bell sent a note. Meg reached for her shoulder bag and fished out the scrap of paper. Her mother crossed to the sink with a plastic bag of spinach, barely glancing at the note. I suppose it's all right, she said. Her voice was distant. Gracie made an exultant circle with her thumb and forefinger, then scooped up her books. I have to go, she said. My mother will be looking for me. That was a lie. Gracie's mother worked the second shift as a hostess in a restaurant and was never home after school. But Meg didn't blame her for wanting to leave, now that the business of the party was settled. The kitchen fairly crackled with anger. Thanks for asking me. Meg followed Gracie to the door, but her anticipation of the party was spoiled. Of course she had wanted her mother to say she could go, but not that way. Not as if she didn't give a darn. See you tomorrow, Gracie said cheerfully. We're going to have a terrific time, Maggie. Just wait. She seemed to have already forgotten the argument they'd overheard. Meg watched her friend run past the elevator and down the stairs. She was in no hurry to go back into the apartment. When she did, the silence was terrible. Not at all the comfortable quiet she enjoyed when she was home alone. Her mother was still in the kitchen, and at the other end of the apartment, the bedroom door remained closed. Meg stood in the hallway, yearning for a miracle. She wished desperately that they could all go back an hour, if only the argument had never happened. She remembered what Bill had said about their mother's angry outbursts. Little explosions that prevent the big one. Was this the big one he meant? Certainly something important, something frightening had happened between their parents this afternoon. Thoughts of her brother raised Meg's spirits. Maybe he'd know what was wrong and how to fix it. She went to the window and looked down the street. "Hurry up, Bill," she said. "I'm scared." Almost as if he'd heard her, Bill came out the door of the superette. He looked straight up at the window where she was standing, and then he turned a cartwheel right there in front of the store. It was such a surprise that for a moment Meg didn't understand what he was telling her. When she did, her heart seemed to stop. "Mama! Dad!" She ran to the hall and shrieked in one direction and then the other. "Bill won! Bill won the contest!" The bedroom door swung open and her father came out, looking tousled and unhappy. "What do you mean he won?" her mother demanded from the kitchen doorway. "How in the world would you know that?" Meg was so excited that the words piled up in her throat. "The window!" she gasped. "Look out the window!" They followed her into the living room and looked up the street. "Oh, dear God," her mother whispered, and it sounded like a tiny prayer, because there was shy, unathletic Bill doing one cartwheel after another down the middle of the sidewalk, while passers-by hurried to get out of his way. If he hadn't won the science contest, he'd certainly gone right out of his mind. That's the end of chapter 2. So until we see each other next time, Grammie says, ta-ta for now.